Everyone was told not to adopt this girl. Too broken, too angry, too much trouble. But one man didn't listen. A stubborn farmer with nothing left but his dying orchard, and a feeling he couldn't ignore. She arrived, silent and guarded, hoarding food, ready to run. He let her fight, let her rage, but never gave up. Just as she started to believe this place could be different, the past came knocking. Her mother wanted her back. Now she must choose, walk away, or fight for the family she never thought she'd have. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting Whitmore orchards in gentle strokes of gold. James's eyes opened at 5:30 a.m., just as they had every day for the past 30 years. The old farmhouse creaked around him as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his joints protesting with familiar aches. The quilt his mother had made decades ago slipped to the floor, and he bent to retrieve it, smoothing it back onto the bed with weathered hands. In the kitchen, James moved through his morning routine like clockwork. The ancient coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the quiet house with its comforting gurgle. The aroma of fresh coffee slowly pushed away the lingering stillness of night. Through the window, he could see the barn cats gathering, waiting for their breakfast. Their meows grew more insistent as he stepped onto the porch, food bowl in hand. The wooden boards beneath his feet had memorized his footsteps over the years, knowing exactly where to creak. All right, he muttered, setting down the bowl. The cats swarmed around his feet, their tails brushing against his worn work boots. The orange tabby, the oldest of the bunch, hung back until the others had started eating, just like always. Coffee in hand, James walked down the familiar path between the apple trees. The morning dew soaked his pant legs, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the trees. His trees. The ones his father had planted and his father before him. 3 generations of Whitmores had walked these same rows, checking leaves and testing soil. But now, something was wrong. He stopped at a particularly troubled row. The leaves hung limp, their usual vibrant green dulled to a sickly shade. Where clusters of apples should have been forming, there were only a few scattered fruits, most of them undersized and spotted. James reached out, touching one of the leaves. It crumbled between his fingers, leaving a dusty residue on his calloused skin. The sweet, earthy smell of the orchard was still there, but underneath lay something else, a heaviness that matched the weight in his chest. A crow called from somewhere overhead, its harsh cry echoing his own unspoken worries. This land had been his whole life, but now it was slipping away, just like everything else had. By late morning, James was driving his '89 Ford pickup into town. The truck's familiar rattles and squeaks accompanied him down Main Street to Russell's Hardware. The open sign swung gently in the breeze, its red letters faded from years in the sun. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, nodding to Mark behind the counter, who was helping Mrs. Peterson pick out paint swatches. While waiting in line with his supplies, fertilizer, and new pruning shears, James couldn't help but overhear 2 women talking nearby. Their voices carried in the quiet store, mixing with the soft hum of the overhead fans and the radio playing country music in the background. "It's such a shame about Cassie," one woman said. James recognized her as Ellen Carter, a local social worker. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, worry lines etched deep around her eyes. 23 homes, Nancy, 23. "I know," the other woman replied, shaking her head. Her fingers nervously twisted the pendant on her necklace. "She's smart as a whip, but she won't let anyone close. Always has an escape route planned." "Did you see the way she mapped out every exit in the last home? Knew exactly which windows would open, which doors squeaked, even figured out which floorboards would give her away at night. Can't blame her, really. After that many placements, anyone would be looking for the quickest way out." James found himself listening more intently, his hands tightening around the pruning shears. The metal handle dug into his palm, but he barely felt it. "If we can't find someone to take her..." Ellen's voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken implications. "The group home," Nancy finished grimly. "You know how those places are, especially for someone like her." Before James could stop himself, he turned toward them. "What happens if no one takes her?" The women startled, not having realized anyone was listening. Ellen's face shifted into a careful, professional expression. James knew that look. She'd seen too many people think they could fix broken kids. Her clipboard pressed tighter against her chest like a shield. Nancy was more direct. "She'll end up in a state-run facility," she said bluntly. "It won't be good. They're overcrowded, understaffed, and—" She let the rest hang in the air. James nodded slowly, saying nothing more. He paid for his supplies and walked out to his truck, the bell chiming behind him with a sort of finality. As he drove home, the conversation played over and over in his mind, like leaves caught in a persistent wind. 23 homes, always looking for exits. The words settled over him like storm clouds, heavy with unspoken possibility. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the orchard came into view, its troubled trees waiting for answers he wasn't sure he had. James jolted awake at 6 a.m., an hour earlier than usual. The conversation from yesterday's hardware store visit echoed in his mind like a persistent wind chime. 23 homes, always ready to run. The words followed him as he pulled on his worn work boots and shuffled to the kitchen, his joints protesting the early movement. The coffee tasted bitter this morning, despite using the same grounds he always did. Through the window, he watched the sun climb over the eastern tree line, casting long shadows across his failing orchard. The quiet felt different today, heavier somehow, like the air before a storm. Even the barn cats seemed subdued as they wound around his ankles during their morning feeding, their usual demanding meows replaced by soft purrs. By 7, James was among the apple trees, checking irrigation lines and examining leaves for signs of disease. But his mind kept wandering back to that girl, Cassie. He'd seen plenty of troubled kids in town over the years, watching them come and go like seasons, but something about her story nagged at him. 23 homes. The number itself told a story of rejection, of doors closing, of boxes packed and repacked until cardboard corners wore thin. The morning dragged on, each task feeling mechanical and hollow. The orchard had always been enough, his refuge, his purpose, his reason to get up each morning. But today, the rows of trees felt too orderly, too predictable, too empty, like soldiers standing at attention with no battle to fight. At 9 o'clock, James found himself sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the old cream-colored landline phone mounted on the wall. His coffee had gone cold, untouched, leaving a dark ring on the wooden coaster beneath. The phone's plastic surface was slightly yellowed with age, the cord curled tight from decades of use, marking countless conversations, both good and bad. He drummed his fingers on the wooden tabletop, creating a nervous rhythm that filled the quiet kitchen, echoing off the worn linoleum floors. Finally, with a deep breath that seemed to empty his lungs completely, he stood and dialed the number for child services. Each button press felt deliberate, heavy with consequence, like stepping stones across a river with no way back. Child Services, Ellen Carter speaking. James cleared his throat, suddenly dry. "Mrs. Carter, James Whitmore here. About that girl you mentioned yesterday." "I had a feeling you might call," Ellen replied, her voice careful, measured, like someone handling fragile glass. "What does it take?" James asked, his free hand gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles whitened. "To foster, I mean." There was a pause on the line filled with static and unspoken warnings. "Mr. Whitmore, before we go any further, you need to understand something about Cassie. She's not an easy placement. She fights, she steals, she runs. She doesn't trust anyone, and she's got good reasons not to." James nodded, though Ellen couldn't see him. "I understand." "No, I don't think you do," Ellen continued, her voice firm as steel. "She's not looking for a family, James. She's survived this long by keeping everyone at arm's length. I need to know you're serious before I even consider this. She can't handle another failed placement." James's grip on the counter loosened. His voice came out steady, certain as sunrise. "What do I have to do?" By late afternoon, James found himself at the agency office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork that seemed to grow taller by the minute. The forms seemed endless. Background checks, financial statements, home study agreements. His hand cramped as he filled out page after page, but he didn't stop, each signature bringing him closer to something he hadn't known he was missing. Ellen stood nearby, watching him work through the forms with methodical determination. She'd seen plenty of potential foster parents come through her office, full of good intentions that crumbled in the face of reality, like autumn leaves in the first frost. "You can still back out," she said, giving him one last chance to reconsider, her eyes studying his face for any sign of doubt. James didn't look up from the papers. His pen continued its steady progress across the page, filling in another line of information. The choice had already been made, as irreversible as the changing seasons. The gravel crunched under the tires of the state car as it wound its way up James's long driveway. He stood on his front porch, arms crossed over his chest, trying to look less imposing than his 6'2" frame usually managed. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the weathered boards beneath his feet, highlighting every scratch and dent from decades of use. Ellen's car door opened first. She emerged with her familiar clipboard and professional smile, but her eyes held a warning that spoke volumes about what to expect. The back door creaked open slowly, deliberately, and out stepped Cassie Monroe. James's breath caught slightly at the sight of her. She was smaller than he'd imagined, drowning in an oversized gray hoodie that had seen better days. Her secondhand jeans had holes that weren't the fashionable kind, and her sneakers were worn nearly through at the toes. The girl's eyes darted everywhere at once, to the tree line, the barn, the road behind her, mapping escape routes with the efficiency of someone who'd had plenty of practice. Her knuckles were white around the handle of a beaten-up duffel bag that looked like it had traveled those 23 homes with her, the fabric frayed and patched in multiple places. "Cassie," Ellen said softly, trying to break the tension, "this is Mr. Whitmore." James nodded, keeping his distance. "James is fine." He uncrossed his arms, letting them hang loose at his sides in what he hoped was a non-threatening pose. Cassie's only response was to grip her bag tighter, her jaw clenched against whatever words she might have been holding back. The afternoon stretched long and quiet after Ellen left. James made lunch, steak and potatoes, his best effort at a welcome meal, but Cassie wouldn't sit. She stood at the counter, shoveling food into her mouth like someone might snatch the plate away, her eyes never leaving the kitchen door. Every few bites, she'd shift her weight, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. James pretended not to notice, focusing instead on his own meal and making casual comments about the weather, about how the apples were coming along this season. Each attempt at conversation met the solid wall of Cassie's silence, though he caught the slight tilt of her head at the mention of the orchard. Later, as evening settled over the orchard and the crickets began their nightly chorus, James heard the telltale sounds from the kitchen. Quiet footsteps, the rustle of packaging, the zip of that duffel bag. He moved to the doorway, watching as Cassie methodically emptied his pantry of granola bars, her movements quick and practiced. She kept her back to him, shoulders tense, waiting for the explosion, the punishment, the lecture that must have come 23 times before. Instead, James just leaned against the doorframe and said quietly, "Nobody's taking that from you, kid." He kept his voice low and steady, like he would use with a spooked horse in the barn. Cassie's whole body went rigid. Her hands stopped moving, hovering over the open bag where she'd stashed her contraband. But after a moment, her fingers closed around another granola bar, and it disappeared into the duffel with the others. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his words, but she didn't put the food back either. James watched her finish her task, noting how she kept the exit in her peripheral vision, how she angled her body to protect the bag. Every movement spoke of lessons learned the hard way, of trust broken too many times to count. He stayed where he was, making no move to stop her, letting her take what she needed to feel safe. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background, marking time in a house that suddenly felt less empty, even if it wasn't quite full yet. The early morning mist clung to the apple trees as James stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. Steam curled up from the dark liquid, disappearing into the gray dawn. He almost missed her at first. Cassie was so still, perched on the bottom step like a small bird ready to take flight. Her gray hoodie blended with the dawn shadows, pulled up over her head despite the mild weather, her fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. James took a slow breath and lowered himself onto the step, leaving enough space between them that she wouldn't feel trapped. The wood creaked under his weight, a familiar sound in the quiet morning. Cassie didn't move, didn't even twitch, but he saw her shoulders tense slightly, her body angling away from him almost imperceptibly. "We need rules," he said quietly, his voice matching the stillness of the morning, rough from disuse. For the first time, Cassie turned to look at him. Her eyes were sharp, challenging, like steel catching sunlight. Dark circles beneath them hinted at another sleepless night. "I don't follow rules," she said, each word precise and practiced like she'd said them 100 times before. The day stretched on, and by noon James knew something was wrong. The school called. Cassie never showed up. His stomach tightened, but he didn't panic. Instead, he got in his truck and drove, checking the places a kid might go when they're looking to disappear. He'd been doing this long enough to know the usual spots: bus stations, convenience stores, anywhere with easy exits and minimal questions. He found her at Miller's gas station, sitting on the curb with her backpack clutched to her chest like armor. She was watching the road like she was waiting for something. But James knew there wouldn't be any buses coming through. Not on a Tuesday, not on this route. Her shoulders were hunched against the wind, but her chin was lifted defiantly. James pulled up in his truck, the engine ticking as it cooled in the afternoon sun. He didn't rush over to her or start lecturing. Instead, he leaned against the truck's dusty door, arms crossed, and said simply, "Let's go." His tone carried no anger, just quiet certainty. Cassie's glare could have melted steel. She sat there for what felt like forever, jaw set, fingers white-knuckled around her backpack straps. But finally she stood up. Each step toward the truck seemed to cost her something, like she was fighting against an invisible current, but she climbed in. The seat creaked beneath her slight weight. The drive back was silent. James didn't lecture about school or responsibility. He didn't threaten consequences or make demands. He just drove, the familiar landscape of apple trees and rolling hills passing by their windows, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the orchards. That evening, the house settled into its nighttime creaks and groans, wooden beams cooling after the day's warmth. James noticed small changes. Cassie's door remained closed but not locked. Her footsteps didn't pace the floor like they had the night before, wearing tracks into the old carpet. She barely spoke during dinner, but she sat at the table instead of standing in the corner, her fork pushing food around her plate. It wasn't much. Some might say it wasn't anything at all. But James recognized it for what it was, the smallest beginning of a truce. Not trust, not yet, but something, like a tiny seed taking root in hard soil. And for now, that would have to be enough. The rumble of thunder woke James before his alarm. He blinked at the darkness, feeling the heaviness in the air that promised rain. The weathered floorboards creaked under his feet as he made his way to the kitchen, brewing his usual black coffee. The familiar routine brought little comfort today, not with what those clouds meant for his orchard. Through the kitchen window, he spotted Cassie on the porch. She'd taken to sitting there early in the mornings, like a silent guardian of the property. Her hoodie was pulled up as always, arms crossed tight against her chest, her small frame tense with what he'd come to recognize as her constant readiness for flight. James stepped outside, the humid air clinging to his skin like a second shirt. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon, stacking up against each other in ominous towers, and he felt the familiar twist of worry in his gut. The orchard was already struggling after the drought. A bad storm now could be the final blow that brought everything crashing down. "Big one coming," he muttered, more to himself than to Cassie. She didn't respond, but he noticed her eyes following him as he began his preparations, tracking his movements with that watchful wariness she never seemed to shed. By afternoon, the sky had transformed into an angry mass of gray clouds that seemed to press down on the land itself. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees with increasing fury, making the branches dance and sway in dangerous arcs. James worked as fast as he could, his hands rough and calloused as he secured loose branches and reinforced the protective covers over the most vulnerable saplings. Each gust brought a fresh wave of anxiety about what might snap next. Cassie had moved to stand by the barn, watching his frantic work from beneath her hood. Her face was unreadable, but she hadn't gone inside despite the threatening weather, despite the occasional debris that whirled past. The wind grew stronger, howling through the orchard like a wild animal, carrying with it the scent of rain and electricity. Then it happened. A massive crack split the air, louder than the thunder, as a thick branch from one of the oldest apple trees gave way. James barely had time to look up before diving to the side, his instincts taking over before his mind could catch up. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs and sending shockwaves through his aging bones. From the corner of his eye, he saw Cassie flinch, taking half a step forward before catching herself, her body betraying an instinct to help that her mind quickly suppressed. Her face flickered with something, concern, before returning to its careful blank expression, though her hands had tightened into fists at her sides. "I'm fine," James called out, waving her off as he struggled to his feet, trying not to grimace at the pain. His shoulder ached something fierce, but there wasn't time to worry about that. The rain started then, heavy drops becoming a deluge in seconds, drumming against the ground with enough force to sting exposed skin. James kept working through the storm, moving slower now but refusing to stop. His clothes were soaked through, mud caking his boots and jeans, his movements growing stiffer with each passing hour. Cassie remained by the barn, rain dripping from her hood, watching his every move with an intensity that seemed to burn through the downpour. When night finally fell, James could barely make it to his chair in the living room. Every muscle screamed in protest as he sank into the worn cushions, the familiar leather seeming to embrace his aching body. His shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the ground, a deep pain that promised to be worse tomorrow. Outside, in the darkness, Cassie moved like a shadow through the wet grass, her footsteps nearly silent despite the soggy ground. She approached one of the fallen branches, not the big one that had nearly hit James, but a smaller one that had come down in the storm. Without a word, without looking toward the house where she knew James would be watching, she grabbed hold of it and began dragging it toward the woodpile. Her small frame struggled with the weight, feet slipping occasionally in the mud, but she didn't stop until it was properly placed with the other branches meant for winter firewood. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't look for praise or acknowledgement. She simply did it, then disappeared back into the house as silently as she'd come out, leaving behind only muddy footprints and the smallest hint that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as detached as she pretended to be. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. James's muscles protested as he made his way down the stairs, each step a reminder of yesterday's battle with the storm still fresh in his body. His joints ached from hours of securing loose branches and clearing debris. He paused at the kitchen doorway, surprised by what he saw. Cassie sat at the table, her usual hoodie pulled up like armor, but she was there, actually sitting, not hovering near the exit like she usually did. A bowl of cereal sat in front of her, and she mechanically spooned it into her mouth, eyes fixed on the table's scratched surface. Her fingers traced an old water ring on the wood, round and round, like she was trying to decode its history. James moved slowly, careful not to break whatever spell had brought about this change. He poured his coffee, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen, then grabbed the milk from the fridge. Without a word, he topped off her nearly empty glass and settled into his chair across from her. The old wood creaked under his weight, a sound as familiar as breathing. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the tense quiet of previous mornings. This silence felt different, less like a wall and more like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. The only sounds were the clink of spoons and the distant call of morning birds. Later that afternoon, James searched the property for Cassie. He found her in the barn, perched in the dusty loft where he used to store hay. Sunlight streamed through the cracks between the weathered boards, creating strips of gold across her small figure. Spiderwebs sparkled in the corners, catching the light like strands of silver. "What are you doing up there?" he called up, his voice echoing in the barn's hollow space. The smell of old wood and memories filled his nose. Cassie didn't look down, just shrugged one shoulder. "It's quiet." Her fingers played with a piece of straw, twisting it back and forth. James leaned against the nearest stall gate, considering. The loft had been empty for years, ever since he'd switched to storing hay in the newer shed. "Then it's yours." The words came easily, naturally, like they'd been waiting to be said. She didn't respond, but James caught the slight shift in her posture, a barely perceptible relaxing of her shoulders, as if some invisible weight had lifted. Throughout the day, James noticed small changes. Cassie's worn backpack disappeared from its usual spot by the front door, where she'd kept it ready for a quick escape. He glimpsed her carrying an old quilt up the barn's ladder, then a flashlight, a few dog-eared books she'd brought with her. Each trip was like watching a bird build its nest, piece by careful piece. That evening, as James walked past her bedroom, he noticed something different. The door wasn't locked. Every night since she'd arrived, he'd heard the distinctive click of the lock sliding into place, like a period at the end of each day. Tonight, the door stood slightly ajar, a silent gesture of trust. From his spot on the porch, James watched Cassie sitting on the steps below. Her gaze was fixed on the orchard, where the apple trees stood silent in the growing dusk, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. Her backpack wasn't beside her. Her shoulders weren't tense with plans of escape. The crickets began their nightly chorus, a peaceful backdrop to this moment of change. She wasn't running, not tonight. James settled deeper into his chair, feeling the weight of the day in his bones, but also something lighter, something that felt almost like hope. The evening air carried the sweet scent of ripening apples, and for the first time in years, his old farmhouse felt less like an empty shell and more like what it was meant to be, a home. The morning sun crept through the hallway as James made his way to the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the old floorboards. The familiar creaks seemed louder this morning, each step a reminder of the heavy silence filling the house. He paused at Cassie's door, reaching out to test the handle. Locked. The familiar click of metal against metal felt like a step backward, erasing yesterday's progress, mocking his hopes. James let out a long breath, his hand falling away from the doorknob. He'd known better than to expect too much too soon. Progress with Cassie wasn't like tending his apple trees. There was no straight line from planting to harvest. No guaranteed outcome no matter how carefully you tended the roots. That night, James jolted awake to unfamiliar sounds breaking through the usual quiet of the farmhouse. His heart quickened as he lay still, listening. There it was again, soft whimpers coming from down the hall. Cassie's room. The sound made his chest ache with a familiar helplessness. He pushed himself up, bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The sounds grew clearer as he approached her door, mumbled words tinged with fear, desperate and small in the darkness. "No, stop, don't take me, please." James's heart tightened in his chest. He stood outside her door, hand hovering over the wood, caught between the need to help and the fear of making things worse. The muffled pleas continued, each one carrying years of hurt he couldn't begin to understand, pain that made his own losses feel somehow smaller. He knocked softly, just enough to be heard. The mumbling stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of rustling sheets and frantic movement. "Go away." Cassie's voice came through sharp and defensive, but James caught the slight tremor beneath the anger, the way it wavered on the last word. He retreated to his room, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy now. The rest of the night stretched long and quiet, but the echo of Cassie's frightened words lingered in the darkness like ghosts he couldn't chase away. Morning arrived with gray clouds hanging low over the orchard, matching the heavy atmosphere inside the house. Cassie emerged from her room like a shadow, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for escape routes. She slumped into her chair at the breakfast table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without eating, building little yellow fortresses and then destroying them with her fork. James watched her over his coffee cup, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her fork, the defensive set of her shoulders that seemed to say, "Don't ask." "You all right?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, careful, like he was approaching a spooked colt in the barn. "I'm fine." Cassie didn't look up, her voice flat and final, building another wall between them. James recognized the lie for what it was. He'd told enough of them himself over the years to know how they tasted, bitter and necessary like medicine. But he also understood that some truths needed time to ripen, like apples that weren't ready for picking. You couldn't force them. You had to wait until they were ready to fall, no matter how much you wanted to reach up and pluck them from the branch. So he let the lie stand between them, as solid as the locked door, as real as the nightmares that had torn through her sleep. He took another sip of his coffee and said nothing more, letting the morning silence settle around them like early frost. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as James walked to the mailbox, his boots crunching on gravel. Bills, as usual. Electric, phone, water. He shuffled through them mechanically until his fingers touched a thick, official-looking envelope. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the bank's logo, the crisp edges of the envelope cutting into his calloused fingertips. Inside, the words hit him like a physical blow. Notice of foreclosure. The paper trembled in his weathered hands as his eyes scanned the cold, formal language. Numbers jumped out at him. Missed payments, late fees, final warnings. The truth he'd been avoiding for months now stared back at him in black and white, each paragraph more damning than the last. James slumped against the mailbox post, the metal cool against his back. The orchard stretched before him, trees reaching toward the sky like desperate hands. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, almost mockingly peaceful. How had it gotten this bad? He'd known things were tight, but he'd convinced himself he could turn it around. Just one good season. Just a little more time. The same promises he'd been making to himself since winter. Later that evening, James paced the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, wearing a path in the linoleum. "Listen, Mike, I just need more time," he pleaded with the bank manager. "The trees are coming back. Give me until harvest. The apples are looking better than last year." He didn't notice Cassie's slight figure in the hallway, didn't see her freeze mid-step as his voice carried. "I can make it work," he insisted, desperation creeping into his tone. "I've never missed a payment before this year. 25 years of history has to count for something." Cassie stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that tone. Had heard it from foster parents before, right before they called her social worker. Her fingers curled into tight fists, nails biting into her palms. Every muscle in her body tensed, ready for what always came next. The sound of James hanging up the phone finally broke her trance. She slipped outside, letting the screen door close softly behind her. The evening air was cool, but she barely noticed as she paced the yard, mind racing. The familiar weight of uncertainty settled over her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Every failed placement flashed through her memory. We just can't afford it anymore. Things are tight right now. Maybe it's not the right time. Different words, same result. Packed bags, and another car ride to somewhere new. She'd gotten good at packing light, at not letting herself get too attached to anything she couldn't carry. When dinner time came, Cassie sat at the table watching James push food around his plate. The silence felt heavier than usual, filled with unspoken words. The ticking of the old kitchen clock seemed unnaturally loud. Finally, she gathered her courage. "How bad is it?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to hide. James looked up, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something more guarded. He set his fork down carefully, the metal clinking against the ceramic plate. "I'll figure it out." Cassie stared at her plate, grip tightening on her fork until her knuckles went white. The words slipped out, barely above a whisper. "I knew it. It was never real." The bitterness in her voice hung in the air between them, a wall rebuilding itself brick by brick. The distance between them seemed to grow with each passing second, filled with all the things they couldn't say. The old farmhouse creaked in the night wind, its familiar sounds mixing with the steady tick-tock of the hallway clock. 11:45 p.m. glowed faintly on Cassie's digital alarm clock as she lay in bed, eyes fixed on the shadowy ceiling above. Her thoughts wouldn't quiet down, replaying James's words from dinner over and over. "I'll figure it out." 3 simple words that somehow felt heavier than they should. She scoffed quietly in the darkness, empty promises. She'd heard them all before, 23 times to be exact. 23 homes with their "we'll make this work" and "you're part of the family now." All lies. Each one more painful than the last, each rejection leaving another scar she pretended didn't exist. Her duffel bag sat ready in the corner, barely touched since she arrived. She never really unpacked. What was the point? This place, this orchard, this quiet man with his coffee and his trees. None of it was meant to last. Experience had taught her that much at least. Cassie slipped out of bed, her sock-covered feet silent on the wooden floor. She'd gotten good at this part over the years, the art of leaving without a trace, of disappearing like morning mist. Her hands found the duffel bag's familiar straps in the darkness, the worn fabric almost comforting against her fingers. The stairs were tricky. Third step creaked, fifth step groaned. She avoided them carefully, placing her feet close to the wall where the boards were most stable. The front door lock clicked softly under her practiced touch, a sound she knew all too well. Cold night air rushed to meet her as she stepped onto the porch, carrying the sweet scent of apples. The orchard stretched out before her, apple trees standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. Beyond them, the dirt road disappeared into darkness, a path to somewhere else, anywhere else. Another temporary landing spot in an endless string of nowhere places. Just as she took her first step forward, a calm voice broke the silence. "If you want to leave, don't sneak." Cassie's heart jumped into her throat. James stood in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, looking completely unsurprised. His expression was neutral, almost casual, as if finding foster kids trying to run away at midnight was perfectly normal. The steam from his coffee curled up into the night air. "I wasn't sneaking," Cassie shot back, her voice harder than she intended. Her fingers tightened around the duffel bag's straps until her knuckles turned white. James just shrugged, taking another sip of coffee. "Then go." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with something Cassie couldn't quite name. She stood frozen, waiting for what usually came next. The guilt trip, the manipulation, the fake tears or angry threats. She'd seen it all before, had memorized every variation of adult disappointment. But James just stood there drinking his coffee, steady as the ground beneath their feet. Cassie stared down the dark road, her chest tight. 23 homes flashed through her mind. 23 different ways of being told she wasn't enough, wasn't right, wasn't wanted. 23 times she'd either run or been sent away. Each memory a sharp edge against her heart. The night wind rustled through the apple trees, whispering secrets she couldn't quite catch. James took another slow sip of coffee. Patient, waiting, as unchanging as the ancient orchard around them. Cassie felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the walls she'd built so carefully. With a frustrated huff, she spun around and stormed back into the house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows and shake loose years of dust. The morning sun crept through Cassie's window, but she was already awake. She'd barely slept after last night's failed escape attempt, anger and frustration churning in her stomach. Her muscles felt tight, ready for a fight that wasn't coming. The familiar urge to run tingled in her legs, making her restless even under the warm covers. When she finally dragged herself downstairs, James was at the kitchen table with his usual cup of black coffee. She braced herself for the lecture, the disappointment, the threats. But James just looked up, nodded, and went back to reading his newspaper, the pages crinkling softly in the morning quiet. "There's eggs on the stove," he said, his voice casual. "Still warm. Made some toast, too." Cassie stood in the doorway, thrown off balance. Where was the anger? The punishment? The "pack your bags" speech she'd heard so many times before? Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for the explosion that never came. She grabbed a plate and served herself, staying alert, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But James just turned the page of his newspaper, completely absorbed in whatever he was reading. The silence felt strange, not tense exactly, but heavy with all the things they weren't saying. The only sounds were the scrape of her fork and the soft ticking of the old kitchen clock. After breakfast, Cassie retreated to her room, then the barn loft, but the quiet was making her restless. The walls seemed to close in around her, making it hard to breathe. By afternoon, she found herself wandering the orchard rows, kicking at fallen apples and dead leaves, watching them tumble across the dry ground. That's when she spotted James kneeling in front of one of the older trees. His shoulders were slumped as he ran his hand along the trunk, examining the bark with careful fingers. The tree looked sick, its leaves yellow and crispy, branches drooping like tired arms. Dark patches marred its trunk, telling a story of struggle and survival. "They're dying," Cassie said before she could stop herself, the words escaping like a confession. James didn't turn around, just kept studying the tree. "Not yet." His voice carried a hint of determination beneath its usual gruffness. He stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. "See this one?" He pointed to a branch where a few green leaves still clung on. "Still fighting. Some trees, you can tell they've given up. The bark goes gray, branches snap easy as twigs, but others..." He touched the trunk again, his weathered hand gentle against the rough bark. "Others keep trying, even when things look bad." Cassie crossed her arms, understanding the hidden message but refusing to acknowledge it. Her fingers dug into her sleeves. "How do you know which ones to save?" "You don't, always," James admitted. "Sometimes you put in all the work, give them everything they need, and they still don't make it. But sometimes..." He gestured to a nearby tree, its branches heavy with apples, leaves dancing in the afternoon light. "Sometimes they surprise you." Cassie listened, but her mind wandered to all the homes that had tried to save her. All the people who thought they could fix her, make her bloom again. They'd all failed. Their faces blurred together in her memory, a parade of disappointment and broken promises. She turned away from James and walked deeper into the orchard, passing row after row of trees in various states of health. The smell of apples and earth filled her lungs with each step. Near the edge of the property, she stopped at a younger tree, its trunk still smooth and strong despite the struggles of the orchard. Hesitantly, she pressed her palm against the bark. It felt cool and alive under her hand, like a steady heartbeat. The leaves above her head rustled in the breeze, and for a moment, she stood perfectly still, feeling the steady presence of the tree against her skin. A few early autumn leaves drifted down around her. She wasn't dead yet either. Maybe that counted for something. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, but the warmth didn't reach Cassie's cold expression. She sat at the table, pushing her soggy cereal around with her spoon, not eating, her shoulders hunched defensively. James watched her over his coffee mug but said nothing about her attempted escape the night before. The ticking of the old wall clock filled the heavy silence between them. When the school bus rumbled down the dirt road, its familiar yellow shape visible through the trees, Cassie didn't move. James cleared his throat. "Bus is here." "Not going," she muttered, still staring at her bowl, her knuckles white around the spoon. James set down his coffee with a soft clink. "Cassie, I said I'm not going." She shoved back from the table, the chair scraping against the floor with an angry screech. The hours dragged by like molasses. Cassie paced the house like a caged animal, slamming doors and ignoring James's presence. She'd stop occasionally to stare out windows, her reflection ghostly in the glass. The tension built with each passing hour, thick and suffocating, filling every corner of the old farmhouse. By evening, the pressure had reached its breaking point. James walked into the kitchen to find Cassie standing at the sink, one of his old ceramic mugs clutched in her trembling hand. Before he could speak, she smashed it against the metal basin with a violent crack that echoed through the room. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice cut through the air, sharp and sudden, bouncing off the worn walls. Cassie whirled around, her eyes wild with anger and something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. "You're gonna lose this place anyway," she shouted, her voice cracking like the broken mug. "What's the point of pretending?" James's expression darkened, but his voice remained steady as stone. "I'm not pretending." He met her gaze, unflinching, his weathered face set with determination. "But you sure are doing a hell of a job of it." The words hit Cassie like a physical blow. She'd wanted him to yell, to prove he was just like all the others who'd given up on her. Instead, his calm response stripped away her defenses, exposing the truth she'd been fighting so hard to hide. She was the one pretending. Pretending she didn't care about the orchard, about this place, about him. Pretending that running was still the answer. "You don't know anything," she screamed, but her voice wavered, betraying her. Without another word, she bolted from the kitchen, letting the screen door slam behind her with a resounding bang. The cool night air hit her face as she ran across the yard, her feet pounding against the packed earth, heading straight for the barn. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden planks as she climbed to her loft, her breathing ragged and harsh in the stillness. James stood on the porch watching the barn door swing in the evening breeze. He could hear movement inside, the rustle of hay and soft thuds of angry footsteps, but he didn't follow. Instead, he stayed where he was, leaning against the weathered post, giving her the space she needed, even if it wasn't what she wanted. The crickets began their evening song as darkness settled over the orchard, nature's rhythm continuing despite the storm raging in their hearts. The old barn creaked in the night wind as James made his way inside, his boots crunching on scattered hay. The moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. The familiar scent of aged wood and dried grass filled his nostrils as he moved deeper into the darkness. He could make out Cassie's silhouette in the loft above, her small frame huddled against the wall, knees pulled tight to her chest. James didn't call out or demand she come down. Instead, he simply leaned against a thick wooden beam, his presence quiet but steady. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional rustling of mice in the hay and the distant hooting of an owl. A cool breeze whistled through the cracks, making the old structure groan softly. Minutes ticked by. Finally, Cassie's voice cut through the darkness, rough and raw. "You don't get it." She didn't look at him, her words directed at her knees, her fingers gripping her legs tighter. "I don't stay places." James remained still, his weathered face calm in the dim light. He didn't try to argue or convince her otherwise. He just waited, patient as the land itself, his breathing steady and even in the quiet space. Cassie swallowed hard, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her jeans. "People say they want me, then they don't." The words came out bitter, heavy with the weight of 23 homes, 23 failures, each one a scar she carried beneath her skin. James shifted slightly, his work-worn hands settling in his pockets, his voice low but clear in the quiet barn. "Neither do trees." Cassie's head lifted, confusion breaking through her defensive mask. Her brow furrowed as she finally looked at him, moonlight catching the glint of unshed tears in her eyes. "Not unless someone fights to keep him alive," James continued, his eyes meeting hers. The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound, carrying the weight of decades spent nurturing reluctant roots. Cassie didn't respond. She couldn't. But something in those words wormed its way past her carefully built walls. The way James said it, like it was the most obvious truth in the world, made her chest feel tight. She'd seen him with those trees day after day, fighting for each one despite the odds, never giving up, even when it seemed hopeless. His dedication spoke louder than any promise she'd ever been given. James pushed off from the beam and headed toward the barn door, his footsteps soft in the hay. He didn't push for more conversation or try to make her come inside. He just let the truth of his words settle in the space between them, like seeds waiting to take root. That night, when Cassie finally came back to the house, she walked past her bedroom door without reaching for the lock. For the first time since arriving, she left it open, allowing a sliver of hallway light to slip inside. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a tiny crack in the fortress she'd built around herself. The morning sun hadn't yet warmed the kitchen when James settled at the old wooden table, spreading out a mess of papers before him. Bills marked "Past Due" in angry red letters scattered across the surface, and that dreaded foreclosure notice sat like a weight in the center. He ran a weathered hand through his gray hair, shoulders slumping under the invisible burden. The coffee in his mug had long since gone cold, forgotten in the face of mounting financial pressure. The sound of soft footsteps made him look up. Cassie stood in the doorway, her usual defiant posture faltering as she took in his defeated expression. She hesitated, one hand gripping the doorframe, her eyes darting between James and the papers. Her other hand fidgeted with the hem of her worn t-shirt, a nervous habit she'd developed over years of walking into uncertain situations. Without a word, she backed away, disappearing into the hallway. By midday, the house had grown uncomfortably quiet. James paced in the kitchen, his cell phone pressed to his ear, tension evident in every movement. The floorboards creaked beneath his heavy steps as he moved back and forth between the sink and the table. "Please, I just need a little longer," he pleaded into the phone, his voice strained. "I'll make the payments. The orchard's starting to turn around." He paused, listening, his free hand clenching and unclenching at his side. "Yes, I understand, but—" In the hallway, Cassie pressed herself against the wall, hidden from view. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the wooden banister, knuckles turning white as she listened to James's desperate negotiations. Each word confirmed what she'd feared. The orchard, this place she'd started to think of as stable, was slipping away. The familiar urge to run tingled in her feet, but something stronger kept her rooted in place. The rest of the day passed in a blur of avoidance. Cassie retreated to her sanctuary in the barn loft, legs dangling over the edge as she watched the sunlight filter through the dusty air. Row after row of apple trees stretched out beyond the barn doors, some thriving, others struggling. Just like her, just like James. The sweet scent of hay and aged wood surrounded her, a comfort she'd grown to depend on. She heard his footsteps on the ladder before she saw him. James didn't say anything about the phone call or the bills. He simply sat down nearby, letting his legs hang over the edge too. The wooden boards creaked beneath them as they sat in companionable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the orchard. His presence, steady and unwavering, spoke louder than words. As evening settled over the farm, Cassie found herself drawn outside again. The cooling air carried the sweet scent of apples as she stood at the edge of the orchard, studying the trees she'd come to know. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying whispers of possibility. Behind her, James's boots crunched on gravel as he walked past, heading toward the house. Once he was gone, Cassie's hand reached for the pruning knife that hung on the tool rack. The metal felt cool and solid in her palm, its worn handle smooth from years of use. Without a word, she approached the nearest tree, reaching up to grip a dead branch. The knife bit into the wood with a satisfying crack as she began to trim away the dying parts, one careful cut at a time. Each precise movement felt like a small act of defiance against the uncertainty that threatened their world. The early morning dew still clung to the grass when James stepped onto his worn porch, coffee mug in hand. The familiar scent of dark roast mingled with the crisp autumn air as he stopped mid-sip, blinking at the unexpected sight before him. There, among the apple trees, was Cassie. Her hoodie was pushed back for once, revealing her tangled brown hair, and her small frame moved with determination as she hacked away at dead branches with a pruning knife. Her technique was rough, her cuts uneven, but there was something fierce in her concentration. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air. She didn't look up when James approached, just kept sawing at a particularly stubborn branch, her jaw set tight, shoulders tense with effort. James watched her for a moment, noting how she'd positioned herself to tackle the worst trees first, the ones that needed the most help, the ones others might have given up on. Without a word, he set down his coffee and picked up a spare pruning tool from the ground. He moved to the tree next to hers and began working, matching her rhythm, letting the familiar motions speak louder than words ever could. The morning stretched into afternoon, marked only by the sound of metal against wood and their steady breathing. Shadows shifted across the orchard as clouds drifted overhead. When Cassie struggled with a thick branch, James didn't rush to help. He let her figure it out, watching from the corner of his eye as she adjusted her grip, tried a different angle, and finally made the cut with a satisfying crack. The sun climbed higher and still they worked. James showed her, without words, how to angle the blade for a cleaner cut, demonstrating with his own practiced movements. Cassie picked it up quickly, her movements becoming more confident with each branch. When they reached a young tree that was just starting to show signs of trouble, James stepped back, letting her take the lead, trusting her growing instincts. Her cuts were careful now, more precise. She studied each branch before deciding where to trim, just as she'd seen him do. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. The pile of dead wood grew beside them, a testament to their shared labor and silent understanding. By the time evening rolled around, they were both covered in dirt and wood chips. James's back ached from the constant reaching, and Cassie's hands were red from gripping the tools, but neither had stopped. They'd cleared nearly 2 rows of trees, transforming neglect into possibility. At dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with plates of simple meatloaf between them, Cassie pushed her food around before finally speaking. The overhead light cast soft shadows across her face as she hunched over her plate. "It's stupid to let them rot," she muttered, not looking up. Her voice was rough from disuse, but there was something else in it, something that sounded almost like caring, like investment in something bigger than herself. James paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He studied her for a moment, noting how she'd let her guard down just enough to show she was invested in something. The familiar walls behind her eyes had cracked just slightly. "Yeah," he replied simply and went back to eating, giving her space to sit with her own revelation. They finished their meal in silence, but it wasn't the tense quiet of previous days. This silence felt different, comfortable, like the satisfied exhaustion after a day of honest work. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background, marking moments that felt more like belonging than waiting. When Cassie reached for seconds without asking permission, James just pushed the serving dish closer to her, his calloused hands gentle on the worn ceramic. Neither of them mentioned the foreclosure notice that still sat on James's desk upstairs. Neither talked about her attempted escape or the broken mug that had been swept away days ago. Instead, they simply sat together, 2 people who had spent the day saving what they could, one branch at a time, finding purpose in the simple act of refusing to give up. The old farmhouse creaked in the night wind, its familiar sounds a comfort to James as he slept. The ancient timbers shifted and settled, a lullaby he'd known for decades. But at 2 a.m., a different noise cut through the darkness, soft whimpers coming from down the hall. James's eyes opened instantly, his heart tightening at the sound. He sat up slowly, listening. The whimpers grew more urgent, accompanied by rustling sheets and mumbled words he couldn't quite make out. With a quiet sigh, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, his joints protesting the sudden movement. The wooden floorboards complained softly under his feet as he made his way down the darkened hallway. Moonlight filtered through the window at the end of the hall, casting long shadows on the walls. The sounds grew clearer, Cassie's voice thick with fear, fighting something in her sleep. James stopped at her door, his hand hovering over the worn wood, feeling the old paint beneath his fingertips. "No, please." Her voice was small, desperate. "Mom." James's knuckles brushed against the door in a gentle knock. "Cassie." The whimpering stopped abruptly. He heard movement. Sheets shifting, bed springs creaking. Then Cassie's voice came through, rough and defensive, like a wounded animal backing into a corner. "Go away." James stood there for a moment longer, his hand still raised. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but he knew better. 23 foster homes had taught her that comfort was temporary. With heavy steps, he turned and walked back to his room. Behind her door, Cassie sat up in bed, her chest heaving. Sweat made her t-shirt stick to her back as she clutched her blanket, knuckles white. She stared up at the ceiling, willing the tears not to fall. Her jaw clenched so tight it hurt, a familiar ache that kept the tears at bay. When morning came, the nightmare's shadow followed her downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, hood pulled up despite the warm morning. The smell of coffee and eggs filled the air, but it brought no comfort. James noticed how she pushed her eggs around the plate, barely eating, building little yellow walls and breaking them down again. He didn't mention the night before, didn't ask if she was okay. He just reached over and refilled her glass of milk, then went back to his own breakfast, the morning paper rustling as he turned the pages. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the tick of the old kitchen clock. Cassie's fork scraped against the plate, the sound harsh in the quiet kitchen. Then, almost too quiet to hear, she spoke, her words carrying the weight of years of loss. "I had a mom once too, you know." Before James could respond, she was up, her chair scraping against the floor as she left the room, leaving her barely touched breakfast behind. The echo of her footsteps on the stairs seemed to hang in the air long after she'd gone. The morning sun beat down on James's back as he hammered the loose boards of the fence back into place. His weathered hands worked steadily, the familiar rhythm of metal hitting metal almost soothing. The orchard stretched out behind him, its trees standing like silent guardians, their branches swaying gently in the late spring breeze. A few early blossoms had already appeared, promising the harvest to come. His phone buzzed in his pocket. James wiped his brow with his sleeve and pulled it out, frowning at the unfamiliar number. He usually let unknown calls go to voicemail, but something, maybe instinct, maybe fate, made him answer. "Hello? Is this James Whitmore?" A woman's voice, hesitant but determined. "I'm Sarah Monroe, Cassie's mother." James's stomach dropped. His grip tightened on the phone as he straightened up, the hammer forgotten in his other hand. The morning suddenly felt colder, despite the warm sun. "I've been clean for 8 months now," Sarah continued, her words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "I have a steady job, an apartment. I'm doing better. I want—" She paused, took a breath. "I want my daughter back." James stared at the fence, not really seeing it. His throat felt dry as sandpaper. "How did you get this number?" "Through the social services office. They said Cassie's with you." There was a tremor in her voice, a mix of hope and desperation. "I've done everything they asked. I'm stable now. I can take care of her." The words hit James like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last. He thought of Cassie in the orchard, finally starting to trust, finally beginning to help with the trees, finally starting to stay. Just yesterday, she'd helped him graft a new sapling, her hand steady and sure. "Mr. Whitmore?" Sarah's voice pulled him back. "Are you there?" "Yeah," he managed. "I'm here." The conversation was mercifully brief after that. Legal terms, proper channels, next steps. James hung up and stood there, the phone heavy in his hand like a stone. He worked through the afternoon like a man possessed, throwing himself into physical labor, mending fences, pruning trees, anything to keep his mind off the morning's call. But the words echoed in his head like a relentless drumbeat. "I want my daughter back." At dinner, he couldn't hide his distraction. The kitchen was quiet except for the scrape of forks against plates and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Cassie sat across from him, watching him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, the same eyes that had sized him up the day she arrived. "What's wrong with you?" she finally asked, her voice carrying that edge of suspicion she'd never fully lost, the one that reminded him how many times she'd been hurt before. James looked at her, really looked at her, the defensive set of her shoulders, the way she still sat ready to bolt, even after all this time, the trust they'd built, fragile as spring buds, precious as the first apples of the season. He couldn't say it. Not yet. Not tonight. "Just tired," he muttered, pushing his food around his plate like a guilty man. Cassie's eyes narrowed, but she didn't push. She knew he was lying. She was too good at spotting lies, had learned that skill the hard way. But for once, she let it go. They finished dinner in silence, the weight of his secret sitting between them like a physical thing. Tomorrow, he would have to tell her. Tomorrow, he would have to watch her walls slam back up. Tomorrow, he would have to be the one to break her trust. But tonight he just watched as she cleared her plate and headed for the barn, where she still liked to sit in the loft and think. Her footsteps faded into the gathering dusk, and James remained at the table, the ticking of the old kitchen clock marking time like a countdown to heartbreak. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table. James stood at the counter, his coffee growing cold in his mug as he stared out at the orchard. Sleep had been impossible, his mind churning with the weight of what he had to say. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed the hours he'd spent tossing and turning, rehearsing this conversation. The floorboards creaked, and Cassie shuffled into the kitchen, her oversized hoodie pulled up as usual, the frayed cuffs covering her hands. Her eyes narrowed as she caught his tense posture, the way his shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying an invisible burden. "What's your problem?" she muttered, dropping into her chair with the defensive slouch he'd grown familiar with. James set his coffee down carefully, the ceramic making a soft clink against the counter. His weathered hands gripped the edge. "I got a call yesterday." Cassie spooned cereal into her mouth, not looking up, the morning routine a shield against whatever was coming. "From who?" James took a deep breath, his chest tight. "Your mother." The spoon clattered against the bowl. Cassie's whole body went rigid, her face draining of color. The kitchen seemed to freeze, the air growing thick and heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. "She says she's clean now," James continued softly, each word measured and careful. "She's gotten help, has a steady job." "No." Cassie's voice was sharp, brittle, like ice about to crack. "No way." "She wants another chance, Cassie, to make things right." The chair screeched against the floor as Cassie shot to her feet. Her hands were trembling, but her jaw was set hard, teeth clenched against the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "She doesn't get to do this. She doesn't get to just walk back in whenever she feels like it." James's voice remained steady, though his heart ached at the raw pain in her eyes, at the way she seemed to fold in on herself even as she tried to stand tall. "You don't have to go, but she has rights, legal rights." Something in Cassie's expression shattered like a window hit by a stone. Without another word, she bolted from the kitchen, the screen door slamming behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. James watched through the window as she ran into the orchard, her small figure weaving between the trees until she disappeared from sight, her dark hoodie blending into the shadows. Her footsteps pounded against the earth, matching the frantic beating of her heart. She ran past the dying trees, past the ones they'd been trying to save, past everything they'd worked on together. Dead leaves crunched beneath her feet, branches snagged at her clothes, but she barely noticed. The morning air burned in her lungs, but she couldn't stop. For the first time since arriving at the orchard, real fear gripped her chest. Not the usual wariness she carried, but genuine terror at having everything ripped away again, at losing the closest thing to stability she'd ever known. The kitchen light cast a weak glow across the worn linoleum floor, casting long shadows in the corners. James sat at the table, his coffee long, cold, and untouched, eyes fixed on the back door like it might hold all the answers he desperately needed. It was nearly midnight, and his stomach had been in knots for hours, twisting tighter with each moment of silence. The ticking of the old wall clock seemed to grow louder with each passing minute, marking time like a countdown he couldn't stop. Finally, the screen door creaked open, the sound piercing the heavy quiet. Cassie stepped into the kitchen, her shoulders hunched and defensive, looking smaller than her 13 years. Even in the dim light, James could see her red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained cheeks, the tracks of her crying still fresh and raw. Her fists were clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white, as if she was physically holding herself together. James let out a long breath, the weight of worry slowly lifting from his chest. "I was worried about you. You said I could stay." Cassie's voice cracked like thin ice. "But it's not up to you, is it?" Her words came out like bullets, sharp and aimed to hurt, each one loaded with years of disappointment. James's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady, fighting to maintain the calm she needed. "I'm fighting for you, Cassie." She let out a harsh laugh that sounded more like a sob, the sound raw and painful. "Everyone says that. They all lie." Before James could respond, she grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl and hurled it across the kitchen with all her might. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor, rolling under the counter, bruised and forgotten. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with unspoken words and broken promises. James could see her trembling, could feel the waves of hurt and anger rolling off her like heat from summer pavement. He softened his tone, choosing his words carefully like picking his way through a minefield. "I don't know what she told you before, but I don't lie." Cassie's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fury and fear, a storm brewing behind them. "We'll see." The words came out barely above a whisper, but they cut through the air like ice, sharp enough to draw blood. She turned and stormed up the stairs, each step a thundering reminder of her pain, the old wood groaning under her feet. James stayed at the table, listening as she reached her room, his hands wrapped around his cold coffee mug. The lock clicked into place, echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. James stood in the hallway outside her door, his hand hovering near the wood, rough and familiar under his palm. He could hear her moving around inside, probably pushing her dresser against the door like she used to do in those first difficult weeks. His heart felt heavy, knowing that all the trust they'd built was crumbling like autumn leaves. She was slipping away, retreating behind her walls, and he didn't know how to reach her, how to prove that this time could be different. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he finally stepped back, understanding that tonight she needed her space. Even if it meant watching everything they'd built together start to fall apart, like petals dropping from a flower that had bloomed too briefly. The kitchen light flickered as James dialed the lawyer's number, casting uncertain shadows across the worn linoleum floor. His fingers trembled slightly against the plastic receiver, but his voice remained steady, determined. "I need help with a custody case." The lawyer, Sarah Martinez, listened carefully as James explained the situation, his words painting the story of the past few months with Cassie. Her response, measured and professional, made his stomach sink like a stone. "Mr. Whitmore, I have to be honest with you. Courts almost always favor biological parents, especially mothers. Unless we can prove she's unfit beyond any reasonable doubt, your chances aren't good. The system is designed this way." James gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I don't care what it takes, she's not leaving." Over the next few days, the farmhouse felt like a ghost town, empty despite the two people living within its walls. Cassie's bedroom door stayed locked, a wooden barrier between them. Her seat at the kitchen table remained empty during meals, the chair pushed in perfectly straight as if no one had ever sat there. The only sign of her presence was the occasional creak of footsteps in the barn loft, where she'd retreat for hours at a time. James gave her space, but his heart ached every time he passed her empty room, the silence inside a constant reminder of what he stood to lose. He left plates of food outside her door, her favorites, carefully prepared, only to find them barely touched hours later, the food gone cold and untouched. On Thursday morning, he found her in the barn, pacing back and forth like a caged animal between the empty stalls. Her hoodie was pulled tight around her face, hands shoved deep in her pockets, her whole body radiating tension. "I fight for what's mine," James said quietly, his voice echoing in the dusty air between the wooden beams. "And that includes you." Cassie stopped pacing, her sneakers scuffing against the floor. Her shoulders tensed like she was bracing for a blow. "She's my mom!" She spat out the words like they tasted bitter in her mouth. "She gets to decide, not you." James took a step closer, his boots crunching on scattered hay. "You do." For a split second, something flickered across Cassie's face. Hope, maybe, or fear, or a complicated mixture of both. But then her walls slammed back up, quick as a thunderclap. She pushed past him, her footsteps angry against the wooden floor, each step an accusation. The official court notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and unwelcome in its manila envelope. James stared at the formal letterhead, the cold legal language that reduced their lives to paragraphs and subsections. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, everything would change. He placed the letter on the kitchen table right next to his cold coffee cup, the dark liquid as bitter as his thoughts. The ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than usual, counting down minutes they couldn't afford to lose, each second bringing them closer to the day he dreaded most. The manila envelope felt heavy in James's hands as he stood in the doorway, morning sunlight streaming past him and casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The official court seal glared up at him, black and imposing against the pale paper, a reminder of all that hung in the balance. He heard the quiet shuffle of feet and looked up to see Cassie frozen in the living room doorway, her eyes locked on the envelope, her whole body going still like a deer sensing danger. She wore her usual oversized hoodie, the sleeves pulled down over her hands, but her shoulders were tight with tension. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the only sound the distant chirping of birds in the orchard and the creak of the old farmhouse settling. James moved to the kitchen table and set the envelope down. It made a soft thud that seemed too loud in the quiet room, like a thunderclap in the stillness. Cassie followed but kept her distance, hovering near the counter with her arms crossed, her sock-covered feet shifting restlessly on the linoleum floor. "You should read it," James said quietly, his voice gentle but firm, the same tone he used when coaxing a frightened animal. Cassie's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in her cheek. She stared at the envelope like it might bite her, but didn't move closer. Her fingers dug into her arms, knuckles white with pressure, leaving small crescents in the fabric of her hoodie. "Is she going to win?" The words came out barely above a whisper, cracking slightly at the end, betraying the fear she tried so hard to hide. James turned to face her fully, meeting her scared eyes with steady determination, his weathered face set with resolve. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background, marking each second of uncertainty. Cassie's gaze flickered between James and the envelope, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. She'd heard promises before, empty words from people who gave up when things got hard, who packed her bags and sent her away when she became too much trouble. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way James didn't try to sugarcoat things, or how he kept showing up day after day, steady as the sunrise. He didn't make grand promises or try to convince her everything would be perfect. He just was there, solid and unchanging as the ancient apple trees in his orchard. That evening, when James was making dinner, just a simple meal of spaghetti and garlic bread, the rich smell of tomato sauce filling the kitchen, Cassie appeared in the kitchen doorway. Without a word, she sat down at the table, her hands folded in her lap. James served her a plate without comment, but his movements were careful, like he was trying not to startle a wild animal, each gesture measured and deliberate. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the tense silence of the past few days. This quiet felt more like a truce, or maybe even the beginning of trust, punctuated only by the soft clink of forks against plates and the distant sound of wind in the trees. Later that night, when the house had grown dark and quiet, Cassie crept down to the kitchen when James was in his study. She picked up the envelope, holding it gingerly between her fingers as if it might crumble to dust. Instead of opening it there, she took it upstairs to her room, her footsteps whisper soft on the stairs. She didn't read the papers, not yet, but she tucked them into her dresser drawer beneath her folded clothes, smoothing them carefully into place. Not hidden away like something shameful, but stored safely, like something she might need to face another day when she felt brave enough to confront what they contained. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the orchard as James worked on the weathered fence, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made him pause. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, and watched a silver sedan pull into the driveway. A woman stepped out, slim, well-dressed with shoulder-length brown hair. She moved with nervous energy, smoothing her blouse repeatedly. James's jaw tightened. He'd seen photos in Cassie's file. This was Olivia Monroe. Inside the farmhouse, Cassie sat cross-legged on the couch, an old book about apple farming open in her lap. The knock made her freeze mid-page turn. Her fingers gripped the book's edges until her knuckles went white. James opened the door, his expression carefully neutral. Olivia Monroe stood on the porch, clutching her purse strap. Up close, the similarities between mother and daughter were striking. The same dark eyes, the same sharp features. But where Cassie's face held defiance, Olivia's showed uncertainty. "I came to see my daughter," Olivia said softly. Her voice trembled slightly. James heard footsteps behind him. Cassie appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of careful indifference. But James noticed how she gripped the doorframe, her fingers pressing hard against the wood. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "You look so grown up," she whispered. "What do you want?" Cassie's voice was flat, emotionless. "I wanted to see you, to explain." Olivia took a small step forward. "I'm better now. I've been clean for 14 months. I have a job at the pharmacy, a real apartment." The words tumbled out quickly, desperately. James stood to the side, arms crossed over his chest. He watched Cassie carefully, ready to step in if she needed him, but letting her handle this moment her way. "Can we talk?" Olivia asked, gesturing to the porch swing. "Just for a little while?" Cassie didn't move. Her fingers dug deeper into the door frame. "It's your choice, kid," James said quietly. The silence stretched out, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the orchard. Finally, Cassie's shoulders dropped slightly. She stepped outside onto the porch, but kept her arms tightly crossed over her chest, maintaining a careful distance from her mother. The afternoon sun warmed the wooden porch as Cassie and Olivia sat side by side, a careful distance between them. James had brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, but they remained untouched, condensation beating on the glass. "I thought about you every day," Olivia said softly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. Cassie kept her eyes fixed on the orchard, her jaw tight. "That's funny. You never called." The words hung heavy in the air. Olivia shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "I've been in rehab. Getting better. I'm 14 months clean now." "Why now?" Cassie's voice was sharp, cutting through Olivia's careful explanation. Olivia reached for Cassie's hand. Cassie jerked away as if burned, wrapping her arms around herself. "You left me," Cassie snapped, her voice rising. "You let them put me in places where I got hurt." Her words tumbled out, raw and jagged. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. "I was sick, baby. I didn't know how to be a mother." "And you think you do now?" Cassie's voice cracked on the last word. Through the kitchen window, James watched, his hands gripping the counter. Every instinct told him to intervene, to protect Cassie, but he held back. This was her battle to fight. "I just want a second chance," Olivia pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. Cassie's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to believe her mother, wanted it so badly it hurt. But 23 homes worth of broken trust stood between them like a wall. That evening, after Olivia left, Cassie locked herself in the upstairs bathroom. The sound of muffled sobs echoed through the hallway. James stood outside the door, listening to her pain, his heart heavy. He didn't knock, didn't try to coax her out. He just waited. Finally, the lock clicked. Cassie emerged, her face streaked with tears, eyes red and swollen. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "I don't want to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James placed a steady hand on her shoulder, feeling her trembling beneath his touch. "Then we fight." The courthouse loomed before them, its stone steps worn smooth by countless footsteps. James parked his old pickup truck, the engine sputtering to silence. Beside him, Cassie sat rigid, her fingers twisting the sleeves of her nicest sweater, the one James had bought her last week. "Ready?" James asked quietly. Cassie nodded, but her face was pale. They walked up the steps together, their footsteps echoing in the morning quiet. Inside, the air felt heavy with tension and the smell of old wood polish. Olivia Monroe stood near the courtroom doors wearing a crisp blue dress that made her look like any other responsible mother. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup subtle. When she saw Cassie, her face lit up with hope. The courtroom itself felt huge and cold. Cassie slid into her seat next to James, keeping her eyes fixed on the wooden table in front of her. The judge, an older woman with kind but tired eyes, called the session to order. Olivia's lawyer went first. He spoke about redemption and second chances, about a mother's love and the power of change. He showed certificates from rehab, letters from employers, proof of a stable apartment. With each piece of evidence, Cassie's shoulders hunched further. James's lawyer countered with facts about Cassie's progress at the orchard. Better grades, regular attendance at school, no more running away. He talked about routine, stability, and trust being built day by day. Then the judge turned to Cassie. Her voice was gentle but firm. "What do you want, Cassie?" The room fell silent. Cassie's heart hammered so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. She looked at her hands, then at Olivia, whose eyes were filled with tears and hope. "Baby, please," Olivia whispered. "Give me a chance to make it right." Cassie turned to James. He sat quietly, his weathered face calm. No begging, no pressure, just the same words he'd always given her. "It's your choice, kid." The weight of the decision pressed down on Cassie's chest. Words stuck in her throat. Memories flashed through her mind. Nights alone while her mother was gone, promises broken, foster homes that felt like prison cells. But also newer memories. James teaching her about the apple trees, quiet dinners together, the safety of the barn loft. Cassie's voice cracked. She swallowed hard. "I don't know." The judge studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll reconvene tomorrow. This court is adjourned." The sharp rap of the gavel made Cassie jump. People started moving, gathering papers, whispering. But Cassie stayed frozen in her chair until James's gentle hand on her shoulder brought her back to reality. They walked out together, neither speaking. The courthouse steps seemed steeper going down than they had going up. The morning sun felt too bright, too harsh. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking each second of the sleepless night. Cassie lay in her bed, blanket pulled up to her chin, eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across her ceiling. Down in the living room, James sat in his old armchair, the dying embers in the fireplace casting an orange glow across his weathered face. Neither could rest, both haunted by the weight of tomorrow's decision. Cassie's bare feet made soft padding sounds as she crept down the stairs. She paused at the bottom, watching James stare into the fading fire. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. James glanced over at her, his expression tired but gentle. "Nope." Cassie shuffled over and curled up on the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace and that steady clock tick. "What if—" Cassie's voice was barely a whisper. "What if she's really changed?" James nodded slowly, considering her words. "Then you'll have to decide if you're willing to risk it." Cassie picked at a loose thread on her pajama pants. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words catching in her throat. "I know." James leaned forward in his chair, his voice steady and honest. "People change, but sometimes they don't." The clock ticked on. Cassie watched the last ember fade to black in the fireplace. Her voice was small when she finally asked, "Do you want me to stay?" James turned to look at her, his eyes shining in the darkness. "Yeah, kid. I do." Cassie closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the truth of tomorrow settle over her. In just a few hours, she would stand before the judge and make her choice. The grandfather clock in the courthouse hallway chimed 9 times, its echoes fading into tense silence. Cassie sat rigid in her chair, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. The wood-paneled courtroom felt too small, too stuffy. She could feel both James and Olivia watching her, their worry filling the air like smoke. The judge shuffled papers on his desk, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Have you made your decision?" Cassie's throat went dry. She glanced at James, who sat perfectly still, his weathered hands clasped together. Then at Olivia, who tried to smile through trembling lips. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her shoulders. Cassie's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and started again. "I don't want to go." The words hung in the air like fallen leaves. Olivia's smile crumpled, but she nodded, pressing her hand to her mouth. A single tear rolled down her cheek. The judge studied his papers, flipping through reports and testimonies. "I've reviewed all the evidence carefully," he said. "Miss Monroe's past placements, Mrs. Monroe's documented recovery and current stability, and Mr. Whitmore's ability to provide a secure home environment." Cassie held her breath. James's knuckles went white as he gripped the table edge. "After careful consideration," the judge continued, "and in the best interest of the child, legal custody is granted to—" He paused, looking directly at Cassie. "James Whitmore." The tension in Cassie's chest burst like a dam breaking. She let out a sharp breath, her hands shaking. James didn't move, but she saw his shoulders relax slightly. Then Olivia stood up. Her mascara was smudged, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Cassie with a mix of love and resignation that made Cassie's heart twist. "I just want you to be happy, Cassie," Olivia whispered. Something broke inside Cassie then. A wall she'd built years ago when her mother first disappeared. Without thinking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Olivia. The familiar scent of her mother's perfume brought back memories of bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was a beginning. The morning sun crept through the kitchen window, painting golden squares on the worn linoleum floor. Cassie padded down the stairs, her sock-covered feet making soft sounds against the wood. The familiar aroma of coffee filled the air, and for the first time it didn't feel temporary. James stood at the counter, his back turned as he poured coffee into 2 mugs. He didn't turn around when she entered, didn't make a big deal of her presence. It was just another morning. Cassie slid into her usual chair, watching as James set a steaming mug in front of her. Black, like his. No sugar, no cream, just bitter warmth. She wrapped her hands around the ceramic, letting the heat seep into her palms. She waited for him to say something about the court, about her mother, about staying. But he just sipped his coffee and read the morning paper, same as always. Later that morning, James headed out to the orchard. Cassie followed, hanging back a few steps. The apple trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling like whispered conversations. James stopped at the tool shed, grabbed 2 pairs of pruning shears and handed one to Cassie without a word. She gripped the handles, feeling the weight of them. The metal was cool against her skin. James walked to the nearest tree and waited, watching her. This time he didn't start working. He was letting her take the lead. Cassie approached a young apple tree, its branches reaching toward the sky like hopeful fingers. She remembered what James had taught her about identifying the dead wood, about making clean cuts to help the tree heal. Her hands moved carefully, deliberately. The sound of branches snapping filled the morning air. Cassie worked steadily, moving from one tree to the next. James followed, checking her work but not correcting. They fell into a rhythm. Clip, clear, move on. After an hour, James finally broke the silence. "You're not going to leave now, are you?" His voice was casual, almost teasing, but Cassie heard the real question underneath. She paused, pruning shears halfway through a branch. "Not yet," she answered, not looking at him. James let out a small chuckle. "I'll take it." That night, Cassie stood in her bedroom doorway, hand hovering over the lock. She thought about Olivia's tears in the courtroom, about James's quiet strength, about the orchard waiting for her tomorrow. Her hand dropped to her side, leaving the door unlocked. For the first time since arriving at Whitmore Orchards, she wasn't planning an escape route. She wasn't counting the days until everything fell apart. She was just staying. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its deep resonance echoing through the quiet farmhouse. James stirred in his bed, something nagging at his consciousness. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his gray hair. Unable to shake the feeling that something was off, he padded down the hallway to Cassie's room. The door was slightly ajar. She'd stopped locking it lately. Moonlight spilled through her window, casting a silver glow across the floor. In the corner, her duffel bag sat packed and ready, just like it had been the day she arrived. James leaned against the doorframe, watching Cassie's steady breathing as she slept. The bag was a reminder. She might be staying, but she wasn't ready to believe it yet. At breakfast, James stirred his coffee, studying Cassie as she picked at her toast. "You ever gonna unpack that thing?" he asked casually. Cassie's shoulders tensed. She glared at him from under her hoodie. "Maybe." James just nodded and went back to his coffee. He knew better than to push. That evening, after dinner, James sat in his usual chair reading the paper. The sound of soft rustling drifted down from upstairs. He lowered his paper, listening to the quiet sounds of drawers opening and closing. In her room, Cassie knelt beside her duffel bag, hands trembling slightly as she unzipped it. One by one, she removed her belongings, the worn t-shirts, the faded jeans, the few precious items she'd managed to keep through 23 homes. Slowly, Carefully, she placed them in the dresser drawers. Her fingers brushed against something at the bottom of the bag, a crumpled photo of her mother taken years ago. She stared at it for a long moment before placing it in the top drawer under her shirts. Later that night, Cassie lay in bed staring at her ceiling. The empty duffel bag sat in her closet. For the first time since she could remember, her clothes weren't packed and ready for a quick escape. Her heart raced at the thought, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She turned her head to look out the window where the apple trees stood like silent guardians in the moonlight. This was home. Maybe, just maybe, she could finally believe it. The screen door creaked as James walked in from town, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Cassie looked up from her spot at the kitchen table, where she'd been absently stirring her cereal. One look at his face made her stomach drop. "What's wrong?" she asked, her spoon clattering against the bowl. James sank into the chair across from her, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. His weathered hands smoothed the paper flat on the table. "Got some news from the bank." He cleared his throat. "The orchard still isn't in the clear. We might have to sell part of it." Cassie went completely still, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What do you mean, sell part of it?" "The southeast section," James said quietly. "About 40 trees worth." "But those are some of the best ones," Cassie protested, her voice rising. "Number. There has to be another way." James shook his head. "I've tried everything I can think of." Cassie pushed away from the table and grabbed James's old laptop from the counter. She planted herself back in the chair and started typing furiously. "What are you doing?" James asked. "Research," she muttered, her eyes scanning the screen. "Other orchards make it work. We can too." James watched her with a mixture of concern and curiosity as she spent the next few hours hunched over the computer. She barely touched her lunch, just kept clicking and reading, occasionally scribbling notes on a piece of paper. It was late afternoon when Cassie's eyes suddenly went wide. "Wait," she whispered. She clicked through a few more pages, her excitement building. "Wait!" She jumped up from her chair and rushed to where James sat in his recliner. "I have an idea. Just hear me out." James set down his newspaper, intrigued by the spark in her eyes. He hadn't seen her this animated since, well, ever. "Hard cider," she said, practically bouncing on her toes. "All these other orchards are doing it. It's like a whole thing now. People pay good money for it, and we already have the apples and—" "Slow down," James said, but there was a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Cassie thrust the laptop at him. "Look, these places are making it work. We could do tours and tastings and everything. People love that stuff." For the first time in weeks, James felt a glimmer of hope. He looked at his foster daughter, no, his daughter, and saw not just determination, but investment. She wasn't just trying to save the orchard. She was fighting for their future. "It'll take work," he said carefully, "and money we don't have." "Then we'll figure it out," Cassie insisted. "Just like you figured out how to keep me." Cassie sat hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table, papers scattered everywhere. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she scribbled down numbers on a notepad. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on her determined face. James leaned against the counter, coffee mug in hand, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "So, you're really serious about this?" Cassie nodded without looking up. "You said we needed money. We can't just let the orchard die." Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. She turned her laptop around to show him her research. "Look, small batch cider is huge right now. People love local artisanal stuff." She pointed to various websites and articles she'd bookmarked. "We already have the apples, we just need the equipment and space." James set down his coffee and pulled up a chair. He studied the screen, his weathered face thoughtful. "It's a lot of work." A small smirk played at the corner of Cassie's mouth. "Good thing we don't quit, right?" Throughout the morning, they mapped out the details. Cassie had thought of everything, production costs, equipment needs, marketing ideas. James called his old friend Mike, who'd been making cider for years. "Mike says he'll help us set up," James announced after hanging up. "Says we can convert part of the barn into a processing space." Cassie's eyes lit up. She grabbed a fresh piece of paper and started sketching. Her pencil moved quickly, creating lines and shapes that slowly took form. When she finished, she held up her drawing, a simple but striking logo of a tree with deep, sprawling roots. "For the labels," she explained, suddenly shy. "The roots show it's not going anywhere." James stared at the drawing for a long moment, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. That night, James found Cassie still at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and empty coffee mugs. Her eyes were tired but determined as she worked on a business plan. Without a word, he placed a steaming mug of hot cocoa beside her. "Don't stay up too late, kid," he said softly. Cassie blinked up at him, then gave a quiet nod before turning back to her work. The morning air was crisp as Cassie and James loaded wooden crates into the back of his old pickup truck. Each crate held carefully labeled bottles of their first batch of apple cider. Cassie's hands trembled slightly as she arranged them, making sure none would break during the drive into town. "Ready?" James asked, closing the tailgate with a solid thunk. Cassie tugged at her hoodie strings, a nervous habit she hadn't quite broken. "I guess." They drove into town as the sun climbed higher, the truck's tires crunching on gravel before hitting smooth pavement. Their first stop was Russell's Hardware, where Mark Russell was already arranging his front display. Cassie jumped out of the truck, grabbing a sample bottle. Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed steady. "We're selling cider. You want to try it?" Mark raised an eyebrow, looking from Cassie to James, who hung back by the truck. Well, look who's turned entrepreneur." He took the bottle, examining the simple label with its tree logo. The next few minutes felt like hours as Mark unscrewed the cap and took a careful sip. His weathered face remained neutral, then broke into a slight nod. "Not bad, kid. Not bad at all." They moved on to the general store where Mrs. Peterson, the owner, was more enthusiastic. "Oh my, this is lovely, so crisp." She immediately ordered 2 cases. The cafe on Main Street was their final stop. The owner, Sarah Chen, listened carefully as Cassie explained their plans for regular deliveries. James watched from nearby, letting Cassie handle the negotiations herself. "We can do weekly deliveries," Cassie said, her confidence growing with each word. "And we're offering a special price for regular customers." Sarah smiled. "Let's start with a test batch and see how it goes." By early afternoon, they had sold most of their initial stock. Cassie sat in the truck, counting their earnings, while James drove them home. The stack of bills felt real in her hands, proof that her idea was working. That evening, they sat on the porch steps watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The orchard stretched before them, its trees casting long shadows across the ground. James cleared his throat. "You did good today." Cassie stared at her sneakers, then looked up at the trees that had become her home. After a moment, she said softly, "So did you." The dark clouds rolled in fast, turning the afternoon sky an ominous shade of gray. James stood at the edge of the orchard, his weathered face creased with worry as he studied the approaching storm. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. "It's gonna be a bad one," James muttered, his voice barely audible over the growing howl of the wind. Cassie stood by the barn, her hands clenched into tight fists. Her heart pounded against her ribs as memories of other storms, other disasters flooded back. The first drops of rain fell hard and heavy. Within minutes, it was a downpour. James moved quickly, grabbing ropes and stakes from the barn. Without being asked, Cassie followed, carrying what she could. They worked together in the storm, securing young trees with ropes, covering sensitive equipment with tarps. The wind grew stronger, whipping rain sideways. Thunder cracked overhead, making Cassie jump. "Stay close!" James shouted over the storm's roar. They moved from tree to tree, checking supports, clearing loose branches. The work was hard, but Cassie didn't complain. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, but she kept going. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air. A massive branch from one of the older trees broke free, swinging down toward where Cassie stood. Her eyes went wide with fear. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee like she always had before. For a split second, her muscles tensed, ready to bolt. But something stopped her. Instead of running, she dove forward, rolling away from the falling branch. When she got to her feet, she was shaking. Not from fear, but from the realization that she'd stayed. "You okay?" James called out, concern etched on his face. Cassie nodded, already moving to help him secure another tree. They worked for hours as the storm raged around them, fighting to protect what was theirs. When the worst finally passed, they stumbled back into the house, soaked and exhausted. They sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from mugs of hot coffee. Cassie's hands were raw from rope burn, her muscles aching. But something felt different inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "I didn't run," she whispered almost to herself. James looked at her over his mug, his eyes soft with understanding. "No, you didn't." Cassie stared into her coffee, letting that truth sink in. For the first time in her life, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd never run again. This was home. These trees were hers to protect. This place, and this man who had fought so hard to keep her, they were worth staying for. The morning sun painted the orchard in soft golden light as James and Cassie made their way through the rows of apple trees. James carried a young sapling in his arms, its tender branches swaying gently in the breeze. Cassie walked beside him, clutching a shovel, her steps purposeful and steady. They stopped at a cleared space between two mature trees. James had chosen this spot carefully, where the soil was rich and dark, where the sunlight would reach just right. Cassie drove the shovel into the earth, carving out a perfect circle. "This one's yours," James said, his voice gruff but warm. "You plant it, you take care of it." Cassie paused, her hands hovering over the freshly turned soil. The meaning wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about planting a tree. This was about putting down roots, about choosing to stay, about believing in something permanent. She knelt down, pressing her hands into the cool earth. James held the sapling steady as she worked, carefully spreading the roots and packing soil around them. Her movements were gentle but sure, like she'd been doing this her whole life. James watched her work, pride softening his weathered features. The orchard had a future now. The cider business was taking off, the bank had backed off, and the trees were thriving under their care. But more than that, Cassie had a future here. She wasn't just staying because she had to anymore. She was choosing this place, this life, this family. When the last bit of soil was patted down, Cassie sat back on her heels, studying their handiwork. The young tree stood tall and straight, its leaves catching the morning light. James placed a calloused hand on her shoulder just for a moment, a gesture that spoke volumes in their shared language of small moments and quiet understanding. Cassie dusted off her hands and looked up at James. Something shifted in her expression. A final wall coming down. A truth she'd been holding back finally breaking free. "Thanks, Dad," she said simply. James didn't speak. He couldn't. But he swallowed hard and nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright in the morning sun. If you enjoyed the story of James, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.